I was initially supposed to speak on the topic, which way Africa? The email that I received inviting me to speak here today said the following, and I'm going to read it out. We would like you to share with us the causes of underdevelopment in Africa and the best ways that progress and development can be achieved. We hope that through your discourse, we can understand how we got here, where we are, and which way is best to go for the continent at this time. We look forward to hearing a balance of ideas and policies critical to development in line with the theme. So naturally, as a writer, I'm going to do the exact opposite and go off script, because that's just what we do. Today, I'm going to tell you a story instead. And hopefully when I'm done telling this story, we will go away with a better understanding of what Africa's situation is and how we can be protagonists in Africa's growth story as against just participants in a Zoom webinar. So here we go. I'll start by introducing the setting and characters in my story. Now, there are three people holding a meeting that looks similar to an AA meeting, but instead of Alcoholics Anonymous, the meeting is a meeting of an acronym called ABRA, or ABRA. Now, ABRA stands for African Banana Republics Anonymous. Now, it is a support group where members meet weekly to exchange stories and discuss solutions to their problems. You cannot see or hear the other attendees at this meeting, so you will have to make do with what I tell you that they are saying. So here goes. The first attendee is a lady called Virginia. Now, Virginia's home country is something of a puzzle to outsiders. People can't understand why the country is not more successful than it is, because on the surface, it has everything going for it. It has a large entrepreneurial population, it has a large expanse of agricultural land that can support 2 or 3 times its current population. It even has a few decades of unbroken democratic government, unlike its neighbors, which are still trapped in that jinx of military dictatorship. So, why exactly is Virginia's home country unsuccessful? In her words, her home country could very well be Africa's wealthiest country. And in fact, by some measures, you could argue that it already is. The problem, she says, is that it is a country almost entirely obsessed with government. The institution and activities of government are what citizens of this country sleep and wake up to. Competing in an election is this country's equivalent of listing in an IPO, getting your stocks listed on the NASDAQ in the American public imagination. Getting a job in the government or obtaining a government contract is like winning the lottery in Virginia's country. The process of tendering for public contracts is the full-time job of far too many people. And the entire economy has been subsumed in one way or the other by the government or by activities of the government. Now, in this country, people cannot export goods from the country, people cannot import goods into the country, people cannot carry out any kind of production or transformative process inside the country, or even buy and sell certain things like land without 1,001 licenses, permissions, certificates, and consents. We take months or even years to process and involve interacting with the country's Leviathan government in what is almost inevitably a very long, expensive, and frustrating process. Virginia sounds like she dislikes her country, but she's also keen to point out that it's not all bad. Her government, which funds itself primarily through sales income from an in-demand natural resource which the country exports, also provides a series of subsidies, subventions, interventions, price control mechanisms, and sometimes even outright freebies that are intended to make life less difficult for its citizens. In fact, the government spends up to 1/3 of its annual income on one single subsidy intended to make life just that little bit more bearable for its citizens. Despite this effort, Virginia's country is statistically one of the worst places to be born in the world. Its life expectancy is just 55 years, and it has a giant unemployment rate exceeding 50%. Its public education, transport, and health infrastructure is among the worst in the world. And worst of all, the people seem to genuinely hate each other based on the country's very sharp ethnic, regional, and religious divisions. So Virginia wants to know, what exactly is the matter with her country, and what can be done about it? How can a country have so much going for it and still manage to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory so consistently and so spectacularly? Let's move on to the second person in attendance. His name is Colonel Mbaku, and he comes from a little-known African country with an unpronounceable name. Located somewhere in East Central Africa, Colonel Mbaku's country lost its lifetime dictator in 2018, triggering a bloody succession battle between two rival factions. On the one hand, the former dictator's son wanted to take over his father's job, but the colonel was having none of it. After winning the civil war that ensued briefly between troops loyal to the colonel and the opposing Republican guards loyal to the dictator's son, Colonel Mbaku personally executed the former leader's son and installed himself as paramount leader of the unpronounceable republic. His first act in office was to take control of the country's sole economic lifeline, which was an exportable metal ore. And this made him an incredibly wealthy and powerful person in a very short space of time. After which he then stuffed all key state appointments in the country with his family, friends, and kinsmen. Now, Colonel Mbaku considers himself to be a fair and equitable leader, and he tells me that he makes sure that all regions in his country have a share of the state-controlled wealth. He shares the love, he spreads it around. He doesn't keep everything to himself. Unlike his predecessor, he doesn't want to sit on the money and keep it only for his friends and family. Obviously, they will get their share, but he also makes sure that the whole country is touched. So then, why is Colonel Mbaku here at this Abra meeting? Well, according to him, despite his best efforts at pacifying every region of the country with a share of the resource export proceeds, the people are dissatisfied. Armed groups keep forming in the border regions, even though his well-armed military keeps putting down these armed groups with extreme prejudice. Young people in the unpronounceable republic are unhappy with him, and he's considering banning access to social media because they use Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok to organize protests against his government, which he doesn't want. Colonel Mbaku cannot understand why they cannot see the efforts he's making for them. After a fall in the global price of the country's sole export and the subsequent cash crunch in his government, he even took out loans totaling $17 billion, and he used these loans to build new infrastructure to create jobs such as roads, schools, hospitals, a new cross-country railway system, a world-class theme park to attract foreign tourists, and a new capital city in what is still in the middle of the jungle for now. If you could see Colonel Mbaku right now, he's looking at the camera and he's complaining, why can't they appreciate what I'm doing for them? Don't they know that they are better off under me than that old man or his son? Now finally, it's time to listen to our third attendee, who just wants to be known as Dr. C. Unlike the other two Abra members here, Dr. C's country has pretty much nothing going for it at all. It has no especially significant government income from natural resource exports. Its people are terribly poor, life expectancy is under 60 years of age, and as you leave the capital city of the country, the life expectancy reduces significantly the further in country that you go. According to Dr. C, his country is a geographical anomaly created by a colonial interest that was only interested in natural resource exploitation. So no thought was given to any sort of viability or workability of this country as an independent African republic after colonization. By the arbitrary stroke of a European bureaucrat's pen, this country came to existence, and it stumbled into independence, and it's still stumbling along 60 years on without any clear-cut reason for its existence, without any kind of clear-cut self-image for what it is doing and why it's doing it. The country's flag, borders, and national identity are more aspirational than factual. If one were to travel across Dr. C's country, from the capital city to its second most populated city by air, the flight will take you almost 3 hours. The rural countryside is an actual real-life no man's land, with everything from illegal mining of conflict diamonds to a deadly, never-ending, forever war, and all of this happening inside this vast African rainforest. Dr. C believes that his country's total lack of any sort of achievement or relevance for anything other than human misery is down to the colonial power that created and exploited it before independence. He believes that this colonial power is still controlling the country indirectly and keeps deliberately setting it up to fail, using a mix of neo-colonial tools such as pliant government officials, monetary inducements, threats, and diplomatic bullying. Dr. C is not here to look for a solution. I must make that clear. He is here to tell us that he has a solution, and he's here to tell us what that solution is. Dr. C's solution is to drive those he perceives as loyal to the neo-colonialists out of government by using force if necessary. In other words, his solution to the state of unfathomable human misery and forever warfare in his country is another war. Now let's end the Abra meeting here and try and take stock of what the story was about. Now, as I was speaking, some of you may have realized that the word Virginia is actually an anagram of Nigeria. I assure you that this is completely by accident, even if there seem to be many similarities between both countries. However, the state of affairs Virginia described in a country could very well fit Nigeria and the other two African countries spotlighted. What you may or may not realize was that I just told the same story 3 times from 3 different angles. The first angle is the roughly functional, relatively free African country that could maybe be great, but unfortunately has a government that has become bigger than the country. Unlike what the word government suggests, that institution no longer merely governs the country. It has swallowed the entire country and its economy, in the process making political patronage the most important factor of production, ahead of land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. The political and electoral processes in that society are no longer a necessary evil that happen every so often, but they become a huge, never-ending spectacle. We can see this in our immediate environment where, even though elections were held just last year, the 2023 election cycle has already kicked off in earnest, and we can see that around us. In this category, you can place most of Africa's states that are democratically governed, at least in name. The second angle is the openly dictatorial African states running a centrally planned economy and a closed political space under a strongman. This strongman, despite his alleged good intentions and benevolence, is simply incompetent and cannot run a country in such a way as to produce growth, because the skill set needed to seize power and the skill set needed to grow a country and its economy are 2 completely different things. Inevitably, it focuses on muzzling young voices and attacking social freedoms, while embarking on a succession of grandiose white elephant projects that either remain perennially uncompleted or fail to create the economic growth he promised. The third angle is the bloated, unworkable, unwieldy African post-colonial monstrosity, whose existence only serves to destabilize its neighbors due to its near total absence of state capacity and presence outside its major urban centers. Instead of looking for a solution that would likely involve losing the bragging rights to having a huge landmass, the political consciousness here chooses to focus on a convenient external scapegoat, a boogeyman, such as the long-departed colonial power. When we tell these 3 stories together as one, these stories make up the story of the post-colonial African states, which almost invariably has the following identifying marks, and this is very important. The first point is the elevation of electoral politics into an obsessive, hysterical national sport that never goes on a break, even after the elections, or the growth of a strong man's personality cult. The second point is state capture of the economy via excessive control mechanisms, restrictions, regulations, licenses, or even outright Marxist-style central planning. The third point is an almost singular economic emphasis on state-controlled natural resource extraction. The fourth point is an obsession with national size and landmass over functionality and substance. Now, we've identified these problems, and as the email said, they obviously expected me to also provide some solutions, what I think some of the solutions are. So here's what I think that Africans need to do to solve these problems, and I've distilled these down into a series of points. The first point is, Africa needs to lose the Wakanda complex. Now, I define the Wakanda complex as a state of political and economic consciousness that exclusively and obsessively revolves around the alleged mineral wealth of Africa. Under this false economic consciousness, we are happy to spend our whole lives just jostling for access to a share of that economic pie, which is the natural resource extraction, right? We must understand that the resources in question, in fact, have no intrinsic value whatsoever. They are objectively worthless. The only value whatsoever that these things have is whatever the global industrial economy ascribes to them. It is an everlasting buyer's market, which means that anyone whose business model exclusively revolves around selling mineral resources will almost certainly remain poor. The second solution is Africa needs to embrace market-driven economics. Now, I know that on a continent where our independence movements were almost inextricably linked with sort of Marxist ideology leanings, relinquishing control of the economies to the private sector is a very tough sell. I know that. However, regardless of how we feel about it, regardless of our feelings and the beliefs that we've held for decades, the truth is that the data tells a very clear story. The data tells us that no other economic system has created as much wealth in as short a space of time as capitalism. And even more importantly, that giving African governments overpowering control over their economies has only created poverty and dictatorships. In other words, if you want Africa to become a freer, wealthier place, you need to give up control of the economy to the private sector. You need to decentralize control of the economy from being centrally planned by the government to being controlled by the people themselves. The third solution is that Africa needs to separate governance from elections. As I mentioned earlier, just a year after the 2019 elections in Nigeria, the campaign cycle for the 2023 elections is already in full swing, with full buy-in from the Nigerian voting audience as well. Now, Africans must learn that living in a democracy means that elected personnel can also be held accountable while they are in office, not just at the ballot box. Refusing to acknowledge this and focusing obsessively and exclusively on elections gives politicians the opportunity to turn the democratic engagement process into a cheap spectacle, which devalues it and makes potential voters less likely to engage. The fourth point is that Africans must understand that bigger is not always better. Brazil is one of the largest countries in the world by landmass, with over 8 million square kilometers of landmass and 209 million people. Japan, by comparison, is 377,815 square kilometers, which is just about a third of the landmass of Nigeria, and with just about 126 million people. Yet, Brazil's $1.86 trillion GDP does not compare to Japan's $4.97 trillion GDP. Similarly, the tiny city of San Francisco, which is small enough to fit into the Lekki Peninsula in Lagos 5 times over, were a country in Africa, it will be Africa's largest economy. In other words, the strength of a country does not lie in its landmass, especially if the size only exists on paper and is not realistically enforceable in practice. So, as I'm sure you must have realized, Dr. C could, some would say, refers to the Democratic Republic of Congo. I would argue that it also applies to countries like Nigeria as well. Countries which have huge land masses on paper, but which outside of the urban centers, the government has a negligible capacity to enforce the existence of the Nigerian state, of the DRC state. Devolution, restructuring, repositioning, whatever you call it, power in Africa must be decentralized as much as possible so as to avoid the inevitable restiveness surrounding colonial borders. Oh, and if a country is too big for its current state capacity, let's whisper it quietly. There is no shame in splitting up amicably. And I'll say that again. There is no shame in splitting up amicably. It's not a crime. The final point is, Africa needs to stop looking for a scapegoat and focus inward. Is there actually a boogeyman? Are there people out there that don't mean well for Africa? Does someone out there have an Africa voodoo doll that they stick pins into every night because they hate us so much? The answer to that question is not yes or no. The correct answer to that question is, so what? If geopolitical interests that allegedly want Africa to remain poor and underdeveloped could not stop India and China from fixing their own systemic issues and building themselves into economic powerhouses that they are now, they can't stop Africa either. The truth is that we are, in fact, the only ones on earth who get to decide what we want our own destiny to be. Nobody else on this planet has this power. Thank you for listening to me.